Okay, so red meat, it's clearly like the third rail of nutrition. There's just so much bad news out there about red meat, and this is just a selection of things you can find on the internet, but there's also, mainstream publications, the New York Times, the Atlantic Magazine, just a constant drumbeat of articles about how red meat is bad for health. And you see this, the immediate past president of the American College of Cardiology said everybody should be a vegan for heart health. Harvard, I would say, publishes a paper once every half a year or so about, against meat. The British Medical Journal recently editorialized about meat, saying it was like smoking cigarettes. So it's really serious, the claims against red meat. And I'm going to go over just 3 of them. All of these have been proposed by various top experts in the field. And the first one is red meat and diabetes. And that is all I'm going to say on red meat and diabetes. Okay, next up. Okay, red meat and colorectal cancer. That's cancer of your colon and rectum. So red meat has been accused of being connected to many kinds of cancers, but this is really the one that has risen to the top, and that's because in 2015, IARC, which is the International something or other, but it's part of the WHO, the World Health Organization, and they decide what causes cancer. And so they decided to look at red meat, and this is what they found. They found that fresh meat, like steak, was a probable cause of cancer, and that processed meats like bacon and sausage were a convincing cause of cancer. That's in the same category as cigarettes. So, and the coverage of this was really resounded all over the world. What was the evidence? They published a 2-page paper in Lancet Oncology about their findings, and they said a 17% increased risk between red meat and cancer, colorectal cancer, and an 18% between processed meat and colorectal cancer. It doesn't seem like a big difference to me, and those are both small numbers to begin with, but anyway, those were their findings. And they were supposed to publish a full dossier about all of the papers that they reviewed and what those papers said, and they reviewed apparently 800 papers. And they were supposed to publish that. Normally in science, what happens is that the papers are sent out before they're published, right, to journalists, and you have like a week to look at it, ask other scientists, what do you think, and then you write an article that is, when the embargo is lifted, that can be a balanced coverage of that science. That did not happen here. They published this, and 2.5 years later, they still have not published the scientific rationale for their decision. I mean, the foundation of it. So given what we know, which is very little, what are the foundations of the data here? Well, that 17 and 18% is all based on epidemiology, which is a kind of science that is very weak. It shows association, not causation. What could go wrong with epidemiology? Well, I mean, these are just, you can find so many hilarious examples of epidemiology of things that are really well correlated. So don't consume margarine if you're from Maine and you want to stay married. Or it seems like maybe that's a really good way to get rid of your husband if you want to. Here's another. You just find all these false positives. Okay, here, internet user, using the internet causes breast cancer. You can find a million things like this, and scientists have actually done kind of joke experiments where they looked at people's horoscope and correlated it with all kinds of diseases with the same strength of association and dose-response relationship that you find in the published literature. So that's one limitation of the data. In epidemiology, it's not like you can never use epidemiology to show cause and effect, but it really depends on a number of criteria. The most important one is the strength of the association. So what was the strength of the association between red meat and cancer? Well, So first of all, the great success story of epidemiology is heavy smokers, people who are heavy smokers compared to never smokers, and heavy smokers had a 15 to 30-fold increased risk of getting lung cancer compared to never smokers. That's considered the great success of epidemiology. Compare that to the numbers they found for meat. I mean, 1.1 compared to 15 to 30. And in general, what people who care about the standards of evidence say you should never look at a relative risk lower than 2, because there's just too much possibility that there will be confounding and bias that come into it. So what is confounding? Well, confounding on studies with red meat looks like this. People who eat red meat are just less healthier in a whole bunch of other ways. All of those things listed there, because you have to think about it, like other than the low-carb, high-fat paleo community, who is eating red meat? Those are the people who aren't listening to anything their doctors are telling them, or maybe not going to their doctors. I mean, the advice not to eat red meat is one of the top of the list, anything your doctor will tell you. So those are people who are doing a lot of things that they're not what we call adherers. People who adhere to advice are just healthy in a whole lot of ways that we can really never measure. And red meat people who eat red meat are non-adherers on the whole. Except for you guys. You guys are doing great. Okay, other thing about epidemiology in nutrition is especially poor. Many people know this. It all relies on these self-reported food frequency questionnaires that have 200 plus questions like how many peaches did you have in the last 6 months? How many apricots did you have in the last 6 months? And then you have to figure out, I had lasagna last night. What is that? I don't even know how my husband made that or what was in it. And so these are just notoriously unreliable as a source of data. They've actually been tested when they actually go in and see what people are eating, and then they test it against their food frequency questionnaire, and they find out that the quality of this data is very poor. And that's in the published literature. But they still depend on these. Just to show you why epidemiology can be so dangerous when it comes to making policy. These are some of the spectacular failures of epidemiology. These were all basically public health recommendations adopted on the basis of the epidemiology that when they were finally tested properly in randomized controlled clinical trials, which is how you show cause and effect, they showed that these interventions didn't work or were even harmful. Hormone replacement therapy was killing women. Antioxidant vitamins also had, I think it's vitamin E, where they found they had higher rates of heart disease. So it tells you, let's not rely on epidemiology. So what did IARC do for the WHO decision? They relied entirely on epidemiology. This is the pyramid of evidence. You can see, epidemiology is properly at the lower end of the pyramid, and trials are up towards the top. Well, what about clinical trials on red meat and cancer? Are there any? In fact, there are. But they were not considered by IARC. Here's a big one. The polyp prevention trial funded by the National Institutes of Health. It was designed specifically to look at colorectal cancer. It was a clinical trial, and it was a big one and long one. And they could find no effect of decreasing meat on the prevention of the reoccurrence of these polyps, which is a measure of your cancer. And there's this trial, NIH funded, also 49,000 women, designed again as a cancer trial, right? That was the primary outcome they were looking at. And they reduced red meat significantly in the intervention group compared to the controls, and that's the chart showing the effect of, that's the control group versus the intervention group and their rates of cancer, and they look exactly the same. No effect. Well, so I was actually lucky enough just this week to see a presentation by one of the panelists. So there were maybe 25 panelists on this IARC committee who was deciding about red meat and cancer, and one of them gave a talk earlier this week. His name is David Klurfeld. I've cleared it with him to talk about these points. And he said that he presented this clinical trial research and said, why are we not considering this more rigorous body of evidence? And they said, we're not set up to look at clinical trials. Because